So this video is all about my thesis. I wrote this thesis over the course of maybe 6 months, to be fully honest. It sprung from another research paper that I wrote the year before, and that's about wives of the enemies of the people. That turned into this project, which is on trauma and family separation during the Stalinist purges and into the Gulag. I was trying to find anything on family separation with the Gulag in like a monograph or a book or scholarly article or journal or something like that, and I couldn't find anything. And so I was like, hey, this is a huge like softball for me to hit. So that's kind of why I took it this way. So I also want to say normally my videos are a little bit scripted when I'm going over research. I love writing and I feel like it's really important to write well so that you can speak well. But for this video, I've studied this for so long now and I'm so passionate about it that I really just want to talk about it and show you how passionate I am about it. And I do have my PowerPoint that I presented my thesis on down here so that I have like some points to talk about and remind myself of, but other than that, there is absolutely nothing here for me to read. So to start off, the title of this paper is called The Wood Chips That Flew, Trauma and Family Separation During the Stalinist Purges. The wood chips that flew comes from this Russian phrase. In English, it's when they cut down a forest, wood chips fly. In Russian, it's Les rubyat shipki letyat. That is basically like a proverb that the Soviet government, the Soviet state used, and also its citizens used to justify the political purges and any of the other purges that were happening. Throughout the 1920s, into the 1930s, and even into the 1940s after the war, there were multiple waves of purges. In the 1920s, the most famous one was probably dekulakization, which targeted kulaks or land-owning peasants. And it was basically to take the land from them to prepare for collectivization, which was state-led agricultural harvesting. They were taking these kulaks, they were taking them to the Gulag along with all of their family members, and a lot of these kulaks built the gulags. That actually isn't the very first one. The very, very first one of the use of the gulag is very different from all of the other purges, I would say, just based on the treatment of the individuals. But that was the White Sea Canal being built in the early 1920s. They took a lot of white army officials and they pushed them into this project in the White Sea Canal, which is found near Arkhangelsk. The next major purge is this Great Purge, as it's been known. And then the one after that is an ethnic purging of Poles, Latvians, Lithuanians. After World War II, and even before World War II, there was the annexation of Poland, and then there was also the annexation of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and with that, a lot of people got arrested. What's different about all of these from the one that I studied, and I studied a very specific one for a very specific reason. When you're studying history and you have so many pages to write, you kind of have to narrow in quite a bit. And this is one of the ways that I narrowed in, was just focusing on this one purge that happened. The Great Purge happened from 1934 until about like early 1939, late 1938. The reason why this one was so significant and why it's so well known is because it was so different from the other purges. First of all, he was targeting, Stalin himself was targeting political officials, to the political elite. They were very worried. There was a lot of paranoia, people packing underwear and toothbrushes with them wherever they went. So there was this level of terror, and that's also why this period of time is called the Great Terror. Along with this, there was a lot of death. Like an exponential increase in death. With these purges, there were 2 orders that came out that were especially notable for my research. One is order number 00447. This one is probably the most famous of the political orders that came out during this time. And it basically called for the targeting of anti-Soviet agitators. And so anyone that had anything negative to say about the Soviet Union, and this was very subjective, by the way, and also a lot of the time it was fabricated. Anyone that had anything to say about this was targeted, and their siblings were targeted, and their family was targeted. And that's where order number 00486 comes in. This is specifically the targeting of wives of the enemies of the people. Any wife whose husband had been targeted was then suspect herself, mostly on the grounds that she did not inform on her husband. She didn't tell the NKVD. Here's the thing though. Most of those husbands were charged on false accusations. So how would the wife know that there was anything to even be said or anything even to report to the NKVD? So they were targeted themselves. That order also delineated that their children, now that their children were orphans in a way, the child would then be sent to an orphanage unless they were over the year of, I think, 16 years old. So this is kind of what the Great Purge is. The amount of death that occurred between, I believe, 1934 and 1936 was very minimal. By the time of 1937 and 1938, this number skyrocketed to about 680, just shy of 700,000 people having been shot or killed based off of this order number 00447. The reason why is because the order put in two categories of prisoners. The first category is people that were threatened should be shot. The second category was people that were somewhat redeemable. This term redeemability was coined by the author Stephen Barnes in his book Death and Redemption. Basically, this means that through labor, this person could be redeemed and reshaped into the proper Soviet citizen that was needed in Soviet society. The whole idea of the Gulag on this redeemability was to remove anti-Soviet agitators, basically to remove people that were toxic to Soviet society and put them into the outskirts of Soviet society in these gulags so that they could be reformed and reshaped. This is a highly contested argument. There is a difference, I think, between the theory of the Bolsheviks and the actualization of what happened, because the truth is a lot of people died in the Gulag because they were not well cared for. The work was incredibly intense. They worked for 12 to 14 hours a day. They got very little food. Malnutrition was rampant. Diseases were rampant, especially people that lived in the far east of Siberia in what became very well known as the Kolyma camp. This camp was in basically the Arctic Circle. And so there was a lot of snow, a lot of really heavy blizzards, very low temperatures. It was terrible to live in. And they had barely any clothing materials to prevent from frostbite. So this is a very brutal story that I'm about to tell. I think I put in my thesis like this story isn't for the faint of heart, but it's still very important to talk about. Like, we shouldn't shy away from stories that are really hard to digest, because as a historian, I'm here to digest it for you so that you can just take it in and process it yourself. But just know that it's a pretty heavy story if you couldn't tell already from the title being Family Separation. So I think I started talking about the les trubiat shipki letat, the wood chips that flew. When you chop down a forest, wood chips fly. This was used as justification, basically meaning anybody that was caught up in the purges, it was for a good cause. The problem is that a lot of the people that were given justice, the justice wasn't needed because there was nothing there. A lot of these things, I'm gonna repeat this over and over again, a lot of their accusations were fabricated. This whole idea was kind of what I based this narrative off of. So I'm gonna put a picture on the screen and I'm gonna kind of explain this idea that I had going into this of this imagery. I love using imagery because it really helps to explain ideas in a way that's more comprehensible. So what I did with this paper was I gave mothers, children, and fathers these roles within the forest. So mothers were stumps. You can imagine a forest that had just been cleared, and there are all these stumps that are sitting along the ground. And in these stumps, you can see that there might be a little bit of new growth. And that was kind of what I wanted the metaphor to be for these women. A lot of the women suffered. And a lot of the women, through their suffering, chose to rebuild their life. What's interesting is the material that was available for mothers was mostly memoirs. In the research, I was able to see this like whole life trajectory. It was like, this is where I started, this was the worst part of my life, and this is where I ended. And they were able to kind of create these new lives out of the ashes or out of the stumps that were left behind from their family. For the children, it was pine cones. And I thought that this was a really provocative way of explaining how children were left on their own and they had to grow their whole life by themselves. They planted themselves in the ground and they did it all by themselves next to their mothers in a way, but still separate from their mothers. For the fathers, they were the wood chips on the ground. The truth is a lot of fathers did not survive. So they were scattered along the ground like wood chips. In the taiga, which is mostly what the Siberian landscape is, it's just a bunch of taiga. So it's a bunch of really heavily dense forests full of conifers, which are just like firs, spruces, pines, stuff like that. The thing about the Arctic area is that there's a lot of permafrost, which makes it really difficult for trees to grow and survive. But wood chips are actually really helpful with this. It creates more nutrients in the soil that the permafrost doesn't already provide. And that was something that I thought was really cool to tie this whole metaphor together, that if these mothers were stumps and these children were pine cones, the sustenance of their life was still their fathers. Their fathers or their husbands littered the ground around them and gave them nutrient and fuel to keep living their life. So a little more context for you all, just to kind of give you an idea of what the Gulag exactly is. It's a series of labor camps. There aren't more than one Gulag. It's not gulags, it's just the Gulag. It stands for an acronym, I believe it's Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagery. They just put that together, capital G, capital U, capital L, lowercase ag, so Gulag. And this was kind of like the overseeing branch for all of these labor camps. So there were labor camps, there were special colonies, they were labor colonies. And so these labor camps were scattered across the Soviet Union. I have a picture here. There were actually a lot in Western Russia, but most of them were actually scattered along the outskirts in the non-Russian republics, but especially in the Far East. Those were probably the most known ones just because of how brutal they were. So when I was talking about that redeemability topic and how contested it was, the reality of the Gulag was that it was definitely a moneymaker for the Soviet Union. They used this unpaid labor to mine for gold, uranium, create textiles, farm. They had a lot of product that came from this, and it really helped boost the Soviet economy. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea of family policy and family targeting. In the 1930s, there was a big shift. So most people actually don't know this, but the Soviet Union was super progressive in the 1920s. They were the first nation to have abortion be decriminalized, to have free access to divorce. They were really pushing for women to go into the workforce. There was this whole idea that women needed to be freed from the household, that they needed to be freed from the family because the family was a bourgeois concept. This is all from Marxist ideology, and that they needed to get women out of the house and into the workforce, and then all the children would go into like daycares and nurseries and stuff like that, and that the community would care for children and that family would no longer be an important concept. Well, this was never actually fully realized in the 1920s. There was a lack of state support for this. Like, there weren't enough daycares, there weren't enough nurseries to take care of children. And a lot of people didn't want to live in like this communal housing that was necessary to have like these communal families. In the 1930s, Stalin is in charge. And it's not necessarily Stalin that had this idea that they needed to move away from this more progressive policy making. There was definitely a shift towards strengthening the family, and that came with an anti-abortion law. He made divorce harder to obtain. There was a change in alimony laws and stuff like that. The idea was that from World War I, from the civil war that happened within the Soviet Union, there was a lot of death that happened in the 1920s. And going into the 1930s, Stalin anticipated World War II. He anticipated that there was going to be another outbreak of war, especially with how aggressively Hitler was moving towards war. He knew that something was going to happen. And because of these abortion laws, he thought that people weren't going to be able to surpass the death rate with the birth rate. And so that's why he limited abortion. But the thing is that a lot of people just didn't want to have big families because there was a lack of food, a lack of clothing for children, there was a lack of housing for people. It just wasn't a good environment to start a big family. And so a lot of these people were like, I want to have a big family. I want to follow your policies, but you just don't provide enough infrastructure for us to do that. With collectivization, and accompanied with it is industrialization, there was more of a push towards heavy labor and towards agriculture than there was towards manufacturing clothing or manufacturing other goods, making houses and stuff like that. They were trying to catch up with the West, and making clothes was not a part of that, apparently. And what I noticed was that this specifically coincided with family targeting. Because Order 00447 and 486 both came out in July and August of 1937, Stalin was encouraging families while at the same time destroying them. And I had this question, why was this happening? And I was not alone in this. Basically, what people have said is that the idea behind it was that Stalin was targeting families that were unworthy for the Soviet Union. He was very suspicious of kinship ties. He thought that they could completely undermine the Soviet cause, and so that's why he really targeted these families that were unworthy, undesirable, and strengthened families that were more fit for what he wanted the Soviet society to look like. And with that came my thesis on family separation and family targeting. My methodology for this thesis is psychological analysis. My main idea going into this was, how do I make this more palatable for historians? Because the truth is, historians hate psychological analysis, at least traditional historians do. But I think that it is so interesting to look at how people experienced life with what we know now. I'm not using any psychological concepts from when they were alive, because I think that as a modern audience, it just doesn't have the same effect on us because we're the ones learning about it. So I'm not necessarily diagnosing them either. It's just more about symptoms and saying these symptoms are akin to PTSD. It was amazing to see, especially for the memoirs. They're explicitly saying, like, I had night terrors. They'd be like, if I saw strawberries, I remembered the time that I was taken into the Gulag for the first time or whatever. So it's really interesting how open and vulnerable they were, and I really wanted to be able to take advantage of their vulnerability and share it with people that don't know that much about it. My argument is those who survived the purges in Gulag preserved their dignity, innocence, and past lives through their familial relationships and identities. And we'll talk more about this in the next section, which is fathers and husbands. Each of these sections is divided by identity because of how trauma is defined. So trauma is defined as events that severely alter ideas people have about their place in the world around them, such as how they perceive themselves, society, or their future. And with that, identity is a huge pillar in trauma. And so I separated this whole thesis into 3 chapters: fathers and husbands, mothers and wives, and children. What's interesting is that each of these identities also come with their own set of sources, and I really want to talk to you about these sources because they're super interesting. So first off, with fathers and husbands, their primary source was letters. The truth being that most fathers and husbands didn't survive long enough to write memoirs themselves. A lot of them ended up preserving the memories of their life and their legacy through letters. And these letters have their own kind of background to them. Letters in the Soviet Union were heavily censored, and letters in the Gulag were even more censored than that. And especially with regard to privileges, not everybody could write letters. Basically, letters were written on a ton of different types of paper. They were written on graphing paper, they were written on line paper, they were written on pieces of parchment, they were written on even like I saw one that was written on birch wood. They just got their hands on whatever they could and they tried to write home because this was their only connection to the outside world. Once they wrote their letters, they had to be very careful about what they said because what could happen is the censors could either cross something out or disregard the letter altogether, and they wouldn't know if it made it to their significant others, their wives, their children. So a lot of people actually called the camps hotels. They called their sentence their contract. It was kind of these unspoken rules that people had to get a grasp of in order to be successful in writing letters. And the most interesting part, I think, about the letters is just how beautiful they are. Like, the cursive is just stunning. It really shows the care that they put into writing these letters. And even more than that, when they would write to their children, you could see this difference from the Russian cursive to block lettering. For people who don't know a lot about Russian culture, cursive is actually the more common way that people write, at least in the past. I think it's changing now, but traditionally people write in cursive and it's looked down upon if you write in block letters, unless you're a child and you're learning, how to read in the alphabet and all of that. So there's this difference. And I think that that's super cool to see that fathers took intensive care to make sure that their children could read their letters and could connect with them in that kind of a way. Fathers also drew a lot of drawings, which was really cool to see. I got to go to the Hoover Institute archive at Stanford, and they have this collection of one of the men that I studied, Arseny Fomikov's letters and his postcards, and one of the postcards is just beautiful. But it's basically like this postcard that has watercolor and it's on really nice paper, and it says "S праздником," which in Russian is like happy holidays. It's celebrating Christmas and New Year's. In Russia, New Year's is more of like that like Christmas holiday, like the aesthetics of our American Christmas is more like what they do for New Year's, and that came with the Soviet Union. But Arseny was also religious still, so I think he was just trying to get by with the censors, and so he puts "S праздником," happy holidays, to kind of cover both bases. But what was really interesting to me was the fact that he got a hold of all of these resources, like the watercolor especially, and that's when I found out that he was an informant in the camps, and so he got a lot of special privileges. So let's talk about who I studied. The first person I already mentioned, his name's Arseny Formikov. So Arseny was arrested in 1940, which is different from the others because he's technically not a part of this purge period. But the thing is that he was ethnically Russian, and so I had a few things that each subject had to hit in order to be considered for my study. So the first thing is that they had to be ethnically Russian because there was a lot of pride that came with being ethnically Russian, and that also differentiated them mostly from the ethnic purges that followed that you could technically consider Arseny being a part of because he was in Latvia when he was arrested, but because he was ethnically Russian, I figured that he could kind of fit more into this earlier purge category. He was also a teacher, so he was an elite in some ways. So he had a lot of pride in his identity, which was a little bit different from the other purges because the other people were kind of like lower on the totem pole than Arseny was, so that's why I included him in this study. Arseny was arrested on July 30th, 1940. He was not given a trial, but he was arrested on the grounds of anti-Soviet activities. He was coerced into admitting to these activities on the grounds that he would be allowed to see his then pregnant wife before he was sent into the Gulag system. He ended up in Kansk at Kreslov, and he served 8 years hard labor. Here he was released on November 30th, 1947, but then he was rearrested on September 8th, 1949. And this was common for a lot of these adults that we're going to be studying, is that they would be rearrested in 1940, 1949 because too many of them had been released, and a lot of them, despite their sentence saying that they would not be able to live in a major city, a lot of them went back to these major cities because that's where their families were, and they resided there illegally, and then they were rearrested. Had 2 children, his son Dmitry and his daughter Yevgenia, and his wife was named Anna. He did divorce his wife right when he was arrested the first time so that she wouldn't be arrested herself, so she wasn't arrested. The next person that I studied was Leonid Bolotov, and he was married to a woman named Nina and had 2 children, Gennady and Valeria. And he was arrested in 1937. He was officially charged as a member of a Trotskyist Zinoviev terrorist group that killed Sergei Kirov, which was a famous murder that happened in 1934 and started these purges, and that he prepared an attempt on the lives of Stalin, Voroshilov, and Molotov, who were like the top 3 people in the Soviet Union at the time. He was charged and sentenced to death, but he escaped death just barely because of another order that happened to pass at the same time, and then he was transferred to Kolyma. And then I also studied Yevgeny Yablokov. He was arrested on January 10th, 1938. He was married to a woman also named Nina, and he had 2 children, Irina and Yuri, and he also worked at Kolyma, but he died of malnutrition in March of 1944. The last one is Mikhail Lebedev. He was arrested overnight on September 22nd, 23rd of 1937. He had a daughter named Yanina. I do not know what his wife's name is. He was convicted of participation in a counter-revolutionary organization affiliated to Trotsky or Bukharin and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He did return to his family. He was released in 1946 and he died in 1949 of stomach cancer and was posthumously rehabilitated. Rehabilitation basically is when Stalin died in 1953 and Khrushchev came into power. By 1956, Khrushchev said that Stalin had fabricated this whole purge. He created this terror, and it was all based on false grounds. And that was like crazy for people to hear about. With that, he said, we will be reviewing cases so that you can be properly, reimbursed for your troubles. So people were petitioning for their rehabilitation, and a lot of people gained it. And so they were released shortly after, or like right when Stalin died. And then they were usually rehabilitated between 1956 and like late 1960s. I separated this chapter and all of the chapters into their identities within their major identities. So as a father and husband, I separated it into as a man, as a father, and as a husband. So as a man, a lot of their traumas were surrounding this identity as a man. So it came with labor. As a man, most of the Gulag population was made up of men. There was actually, I think it was about 96% men, maybe a little bit less, maybe 94% men. So it was because the labor was so harsh. So men were sent into mines that were completely unsafe. They were sent into tree felling, which was completely unsafe. And that labor was really difficult for them because traditionally their identity was based on their labor. Even though women were working in the Soviet Union, men had better jobs. They were able to be teachers, they were able to be administrators, they were able to be politicians. Very rarely were women given such prestigious positions, and it wasn't because they were necessarily aiming at being sexist in that way and giving women this glass ceiling. It was more like women's place was to be a mother, and they had a lot of limitations that came with that. So it was sexist in that way. So labor was a big cause of trauma because they tried to lean into the labor, but the labor was not kind to them. There was also this casualness of death, and I'm gonna be kind of light because this is on YouTube and I don't want to have this video taken down because there's so much other information in it that's so important. But just know that like when you see so much death all around you, you kind of become numb to it all. And so a lot of what was talked about, especially in Leonid's memoir, he would just casually talk about how people were brutally killed, and that was really difficult for me to read as someone who was not, numb to death. Willpower was a big thing, like having the willpower to keep moving forward, to keep living, to not get sick and stuff like that. But then ultimately people would get sick because when you're working that hard, when you're barely getting any food, when you're around people that are sick in your barrack, you're bound to get sick. And that illness was really difficult on men. And when they would lie in this like infirmary surrounded by people who were dying, that was really difficult. It really tested their willpower, and that was a place of trauma for a lot of them. As a father though, and as a husband, this is kind of where their survival kicked in. They survived because they leaned into these identities as a husband and as a father. For example, as a father, They were disciplinarians. So one of the really interesting things was Arseny was sending letters back home, and he talked to his son Dimitri, and he was like, you need to be good for your mother, and you need to tell your sister to be good to your mother because she's working really hard, and you should love your mother. And this is all over letter. They were also cultural and educational upbringers. So I remember reading Yevgeny was talking to his children, and he was like, I find myself wanting to share all of my thoughts, or those that are in any way valuable to you and Yuri. I feel such a strong desire to share them with you. Life has such a wonderful potential, and yet so much of it is terrible. It is really only faith and goodness that saves us from despondency and sustains us. I thought that quote was so interesting because he's the one that died before he could reunite with his family. So he was probably getting sick. He probably realized that he wasn't going to make it, and he wanted to share all of his knowledge with his children. And I think that is just so sweet and so interesting to read about. Just the fact that he wanted something better for his children than what he had for himself. And keep in mind, I probably didn't mention this, but he was a doctor. So he was actually in a very good position before he was arrested. And even still, life threw him a huge curveball. More like Stalin threw him a huge curveball. And he died because of something that was completely out of his control. And even though life was so cruel to him, he still had so much faith for his children to have a better life than he had, which I just thought was so endearing and so heartwarming to read. So going into like as a husband, this is actually where it gets a little bit interesting for me, because going into this chapter, I was like, okay, we're going to be talking about masculinity. That's probably going to come with a lot of stuff that I'm not fully like aware of. So I did a lot of research in like theories around masculinity and stuff like that. And one of the things that came up was this idea of hegemonic masculinity. And that's just kind of like what we refer to as hypermasculinity nowadays. Hegemonic just means like the top. Hegemonic masculinity is basically just like the superior kind of masculinity. So think of hypermasculinity and how men, especially nowadays, kind of project themselves as like, I am the best kind of a man. I am the ultimate like masculine, manly man, like the macho man. A lot of these things that aligned with hegemonic masculinity showed up here, but with as a husband, sexuality came up a lot. So I do want to start with the fact that they were so in love with their wives. Like they revered their wives so much for all of the stuff that they had to go through. Like Arseny completely revered Anna because she had to go through all of these war conditions, because World War II started right after he was arrested. She had to go through all of that with her children by herself. And he revered her so much because he felt incredibly guilty for her having to do that on her own. But the interesting thing about the sexuality is that they were able to practice their sexuality within the letters and outside of the letters with very few consequences. The conditions of the camp made it so that with how many men there were and how humans just naturally are, there was a lot of sexual abuse, but women kind of took advantage of that and they started to barter their sex for favors. And some of the men, specifically these political prisoners, because that was more, there's a difference between like this criminal population of common criminals and this political prisoner population. They kind of had different morals, I'll say. A lot of the political prisoners were kind of like looking down on that, but it still surrounded them. And so you would assume that they maybe would be thinking about it. Lo and behold, they reacted to it in different ways. I'd say Arseny was probably the most romantic with Anna alone. Like he didn't talk about anybody really in a sexual way. He didn't seem to flirt with anybody. He seemed to be very loyal to his wife. And when he would talk to his wife, there were times when I was reading these letters and I was like, I feel like I should not be reading this, because it was like, for the 1940s, it was fairly explicit. Like he was talking about kissing her neck and like covering her whole like neck in kisses and kissing her eyes and stuff like that, like really romantic stuff. So Arseny was very sweet. It was also interesting because at the same time he showed jealousy. There was a time when his wife wrote to him about this guy whose name started with the letter Y. He came over to help her with something or whatever. And he said, whoever this like A or Y is, like I I'll punch him, I'll fight him for you. And he, at the same time, like, also sent her a letter saying, I just want you to know that I've been so malnourished that I haven't been able to get an erection for this many years. Like, just like such like a clear line that he's like, I love you, Anna, please don't leave me. And this is because a lot of women were leaving their husbands who were in the Gulag. They realized that their life was too hard to not have a husband, and they left them. And men heard these stories of other men going home, realizing that their wife left them, and then being left alone, and Arseny was terrified. And so that's why he leaned into this whole, like, I'm gonna keep my wife like really close to me. Leonids, on the other hand, was pushing this idea that he was a macho man. He always talked about being really flirtatious with women. He talked about always like being complimented by women, you know, falling after him. And then he would maybe think about his wife Nina, but most of the time he would like play with them and like, you know, like keep the whole flirtatious routine going. He talked about one time, like after he'd been released, he was working in a nearby town where he was released. He was talking about, when did women's breasts get so big? Like, I didn't realize it. And like how like they were like flirting with him and like pulling their dresses up so that he could see their legs and stuff, and how he enjoyed it. And there's actually this really interesting concept that H. Kent Geiger wrote about in the 1960s, and it's about this nichevo men, which is kind of like, it's kind of like a whatever men. It's like whatever it takes to retain my pride. When they entered the Gulag, a lot of these men felt like they were being emasculated. They needed to assert themselves in some way in this power dynamic. And this is where that hegemonic masculinity comes in, because it's a part of this hierarchy of power where there was a top man that was usually in the Soviet Union, that was Stalin, and then there were upper men who were political elites, and then, surprise, surprise, in the Gulag, common criminals, and then political prisoners, and then women. And so they had to assert that position of power over these women. And a lot of the time that came with objectification, over hypersexualization of women and of themselves, and showing I am a man, I'm a heterosexual man, and that is what makes me powerful. And to just kind of summarize this section, basically they leaned into these identities as fathers and as husbands to help them survive and to preserve their dignity. And this is going to be seen as well in the mothers and wives section, which is happening right now. So the next section is mothers and wives. This is based off of that video that I did about a year ago now. It has similar subjects, so you might, if you've watched that video already, you might recognize some names, but I did have to switch out one of them because it just wasn't consistent with this like pattern that I'm trying to display here. So you might recognize Lyudmila Mikloshevskaya and Anna Ladina, but I switched out Suzanne Rosenberg for Olga Adamova-Slozberg, and I think her memoir actually makes this super interesting. So I'm actually very happy with this switch. Not that I don't like Suzanne, I love Suzanne, but just for the sake of the pattern that I'm trying to display here, I feel like Olga is a really good example. For mothers and wives, my main source material was through memoirs. And memoirs are very common for talking about the Gulag. You might have heard of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago. He's a very, very famous memoirist. But a lot of women actually wrote memoirs because they were A, educated. So a lot of women that were educated could write a memoir. B, because they lived long enough, not just long enough to survive the Gulag, but also long enough to be able to see their memoir get published. There's a little bit that we want to know about memoirs before I talk about this, because I think talking about sources is really important. So like with the letters, a lot of what was missing at times was just filling in the blanks. Like there'd be a letter and I wouldn't have a lot of in between, so I kind of had to just use the letter for what it was, like what it said exactly for my examples. For the memoirs, there's a lot of detail, and for me it was kind of just figuring out the context behind the detail. Like, why were they writing it this way? Because a lot of the time they were politically motivated in writing their memoir, and so I wanted to see, okay, is there any sort of political motivation that could have influenced the way that they wrote this? And then I came to a conclusion, like, regardless of how they write it, they wrote it this way. And I want to see how writing it this way made them feel, because they were very open and detailed and passionate in their writing. I more so was concerned with not exactly what happened, but how these events made them feel. deal. One thing that came up a lot for women, and a little bit for children too, but mostly for these wives and mothers, was this idea of ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss was coined by Pauline Boss, and it basically explains when there's a physical or a psychological loss that the person doesn't like seem to exist, but they still exist. So one of the things is like a missing in action. You don't know for sure if that person has died, but because of that uncertainty, they're not necessarily dead, but they might not also be alive. Like there's this like ambiguous area where you lack closure. And that's kind of the same for these women. So a lot of like their husbands, they didn't know if their husband was killed or if he was sent to the Gulag or if he died in the Gulag or what happened to them. And maybe if the woman themselves was sent to the Gulag or prison, they didn't know what the status of their child was. Was their child dead when the war started? Were they with family? Were they in the orphanage? You know, there's a lot of this ambiguous loss that they had to struggle through. And with the wives, in that regard, I argue that they survived by continuing their roles as wives and mothers, similar to how fathers and husbands were, regardless of whether these identities still existed for them. So even if they didn't know that their husband died, if they didn't know if they were a widow or not, they still continued their role as a wife. If they were a mother and their child was adopted by someone else, they still continued the role as mother, even if they didn't know what their relationship to their child was anymore. Again, I chose those three women, Ludmila, Olga, and Anna, and I went off of their memoir. So Ludmila's memoir in English is Gender and Survival in Soviet Russia. Olga's memoir in English is My Journey, and then Anna's memoir in English is This I Cannot Forget. So Olga was born in 1902 in Samara to Jewish parents. She wasn't religious, but she grew up really well educated. She married Yudel Zakian, and together they started their family, and in 1930 they had their son Alexander, and then in 1932 they had their daughter Olga. Yudel was arrested in January of 1936, and then Olga was arrested in April of 1936. When she returned to her home and was arrested that night, she had to be reminded that she was being arrested and that she should say goodbye to her children. Like for a second, she was so focused on getting notes together, getting stuff ready for her boss in case he wanted these notes from her. And the investigator had to be like, hey, you should probably say bye to your children. And then she went to go kiss them goodbye and was like so overcome by tears. And I think that this like period of denial is really common too. Like just feeling like, you know, this isn't happening and I'm gonna just distract myself and keep going with what I was doing because it's not happening, and then you have to face reality, and it's so heavy and hard. She was charged under Article 58. It was under the Russian Criminal Code. Article 58 was basically like mostly anti-Soviet agitation, but she was charged under Article 58 for being recruited into a terrorist organization by her husband. So they sentenced her 8 years in prison, and then after about 2 years of her being in prison, they moved her into the Far East labor camp Kolyma. She was one of like very, very, very few women there. I think there was like less than 1% of women at that camp. So that really affected her experience. And then Ludmila Mikolashevska was born and raised in Odessa and married. There were unofficial marriages in the Soviet Union at that time. Her husband, in a way, in late 1920s, and then had her daughter Elena in 1930. And then she was away when her husband was arrested, and she started protesting the NKVD on her husband's behalf, and that's what targeted her to be arrested. And then that same summer, she was exiled. So for a lot of the women, there was a choice between just arresting them on the spot or exiling them later, and that's because of another order that was passed, Order 00689. And that was basically an order that somewhat reversed 486 and said, whoa, we have way too many people now in this prison system, it's overcrowding. So instead of focusing on arresting, focus on exiling these women, and then if they seem suspicious enough, we can arrest them later. And that's basically what happened to Ludmila. So she was sent to Arkhangelsk. 10 months later, she was arrested and sent to prison and then to her labor camp. And her daughter was very confused at the arrest. It was a very traumatic moment for them. She gave her daughter this like tiny tutya, which is the name for her like walrus tusk shaped figure, and then a little monkey and a little cup, and she gave those to her daughter to take care of, and they like cried and hugged together. Ludmila was charged under Article 58, Section 12 on not informing on her husband, and then the conviction switched to her being accused of forming a terrorist organization to kill Yezhov, who was the former head of the NKVD. It's crazy that she was accused of a terrorist organization to kill Yezhov because Yezhov was purged himself. So in her defense for herself, she was like, why would I even do that? I don't even know him. Like, how would I even do that? I've been here this whole time. Like, you've been watching me. And it just goes to show like how outlandish some of the accusations became. She served in Vietlog. Anna, she was married to Bukharin, Nikolai Bukharin. They married in 1934 and she had their son Yuri in 1936. And then she was also exiled first, but she left her son behind because she knew that she was probably going to be arrested shortly after. She was exiled in 1937 and sent to Astrakhan along the Caspian Sea. She stayed in Astrakhan for 3 months and then she was officially arrested. And she was kind of moved around a lot too. While she was in one of the camps, she heard that her husband had been shot, which was a big public show trial. Bukharin had admitted to guilt even though it was on false grounds, and that ended her ambiguous loss of him. She knew that he died, but that didn't make it any easier for her. Again, this is split up into these 3 sections of as a woman, as a mother, and as a wife. And so as a woman, lack of dignity was a really big thing. There were bodily searches in the prisons and in the labor camps that happened every 2 weeks, sometimes once a month. It kind of varied based off of the prison. This lack of dignity was really hard on the women because a lot of them weren't used to being naked and prodded and stuff like that. I don't think anybody really is. And it was often by men, and they were given gynecological exams by men that they didn't know. They were shaved in the Gulag camps by men that they did not know. They were gawked at. They were always in fear of their safety. And while I think that that's the extent for these specific women, these 3 women, there was still like a threat to their safety, especially I think for Olga being like one of the very few women in a very male-dominated camp where sex was rampant, bartering was rampant, and stuff like that. And so I think that that fear still lingered over them regardless of whether, you know, that fear was realized or not. There was also a lack of privacy, being in front of a bunch of people, having to use the bathroom, never being able to trust anybody because you didn't know, you know, who would report you, having to just be careful all the time. And there was also the labor that was really hard for these women. Anna never worked before because she was in a position where she had, you know, Bukharin was bringing in enough money. Olga and Lyudmila both worked office jobs before they were arrested, and then they were suddenly tasked at tree felling. And that wasn't a common female task, but both of them happened to be put into tree felling, and that was really hard on their bodies. I mean, how much effort goes into chopping down a tree and dragging it and making sure you don't crush yourself and all of this stuff. Also just doing that after, regardless of what kind of labor they had before they were arrested, just sitting in a prison for that long. And another thing though was, as a woman, there was a lot of sisterhood in the prisons and in the camps. A lot of the women looked out for each other because they were all that each other had. Even the guards and the administration would ask for sexual favors, and so a lot of the time the women only had each other. And then as a mother, this is one place where it was kind of both traumatic and a survival method for them. Willpower was also common for women. A lot of them were like, I can only think about this so much. Because as an example, one of the things that was told about your physical health in the camps, especially where there was a lot of like blizzards and frost and snow and low temperatures, was you shouldn't go back and forth between the outside and the furnace because you won't survive. And it's the same idea as your memories. You shouldn't go visit those nice warm memories too often or you won't survive, because you have to survive the cold for as long as you can. And so a lot of them had to control their thoughts. They had to be like, no, I'm not going to think about that right now, or I will only allow myself 2 hours a day. That's what Olga did. She would wake up every day at 4 o'clock and realize that yes, she wasn't with her children. Yes, she was in the gulag and all of this was real. And then she would give herself about 2 hours until the wake up bell at 6 to finally think about those thoughts. They did send letters, and Lyudmila actually survived off of these letters with her daughter Elena. And I thought that that was really sweet that she continued this relationship as a mother, even though it was a little bit ambiguous. Elena had lived with her aunt at the time, and she started calling her aunt mom. And it was just like this ambiguous identity of whether Lyudmila was birth mother, or, you know, what was she? And there weren't any clear guidelines. And Ludmilla she didn't choose this life. And so she wanted to keep a good hold on her daughter and keep that identity as her mother going, but it was really difficult when she was away. And so that was something that Ludmilla really struggled with. As a wife, I feel like this is something that Anna, her memoir, really like shined in. Even though Anna knew that she was for sure a widow, that her husband had died, a lot of her memoir is about preserving his legacy, and it was written just leading up to him getting rehabilitated in the late 80s. The majority of her memoir was not as much about herself as it was about Bukharin and about her father and all of these people who died, and protecting their legacy in her memoir. They would go over in their memoirs, they would go over their husband's arrest and how traumatic it was to lose their husband. And when they finally realized that their husband had died, like, I think Ludmilla found out that her husband had died because he was in the Slovki camp, which in like 1937 had about like 1,000 people, that there was a quota to kill off 1,000 prisoners. And she found out that her husband was one of those prisoners, like pretty much like 5, maybe 8 years later while she was in prison. Olga found out that when you get a notice that your husband had been charged, or someone had been charged of 10 years without right of correspondence, that usually meant that they were killed. And so she found that out while she was in the prison, and then she remarried. Anna also remarried. So this idea of as a wife is like really complex, because while they remarried, Ludmilla never remarried, but while these other two remarried, they were finding that like companionship that they were missing, but at the same time, it was very difficult for them to talk about their husband's arrest. Like, Olga saved it for the very, very, very end of her book. And same with Anna, she saved it for the very end of her book, because it wasn't as much a literary device as it was like, I just didn't want to write about this for so long, and there were so many other things that I could write about, and now I finally got to this point where like there's nothing else to write about, so I'm going to write about this. So you can still tell that it was very difficult. Even though they technically moved on, they didn't emotionally move on, and so that still hovered over their hearts. And then the rehabilitation, and that kind of goes with this reunion as a mother. So as a mother, they were, almost all of them except for Anna, were released. So Ludmilla and Olga were released in 1948, and then they were told to stay outside of Moscow and Leningrad for so many years, and that they couldn't visit, and so they finally got permission to visit. I don't remember how Ludmilla got permission to visit, but Olga got permission from like her brother having connections. Olga went to Moscow and Ludmilla went to Leningrad. Then the rearrest order that I talked about earlier came along, and they were arrested and sent into exile. And then their rehabilitation came after Stalin died. So they were rearrested in like 1949, and then they were released in 1953, and then they were both rehabilitated in 1956. Specifically for Olga, she was very emotional with her rehabilitation. She was like in a room, like waiting for her certificates, and someone came up to her and was like, "Oh, are you Udal's husband?" And she was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "He was my teacher, and you know, he was a great person." She was like, it suddenly hit her, like so much loss, so much grief, that she just kept pushing and pushing and waiting for finally like a moment to breathe. And she finally had that moment of relief where she was like, I'm not going to be targeted anymore. I have these papers that say I'm innocent. And now finally all the grief like sat on her. And she just started weeping and weeping and weeping. And that's when she realized how much she lost. Her friends that died in the Gulag, her husband, she lost seeing her children grow up. She lost her own life in a lot of ways. And I think that that was what was so significant about reading about their rehabilitation, was like, as soon as they thought that they'd have some sort of relief, the grief just started. So they couldn't catch a break. It was like, I think that's like what's most helpful about studying trauma, having been a trauma survivor myself. I think a lot of people are trauma survivors, but someone that's actually like actively worked through my trauma, like, it's so true that the recovery process is so much worse than the trauma itself in some ways, because you're having to relive it and you're having to face what happened to you and work through it, and it's just so painful. And then lastly, their legacy was really interesting to read about. I think a lot of them worked on making their legacy something that they could be proud of. And I think I love talking about Olga because she just has such great examples. She's a very famous memoirist in Gulag literature, so it's no surprise why. But she has this like section of her book that just has like haunted me since reading it. Like, it just makes me cry every time I read it. But she talks about she was like in her 90s. This is like in 1990, basically, like right before she died. And she talked about having this dream where she had died and she was like in heaven, I'm assuming is kind of where she was. She was in the afterlife of some sort. And everyone was like, hooray, like you have this great achievement of not having informed on anyone while you were in the gulag or anything like that. Like you always protected people, and that's such a great thing. And then she like saw her husband in the distance, and she ran to him and she hugged him, and she could smell the chemicals that he worked on in his lab, like on him and his cologne, and she just hugged him. And they said, at last she's died. And she's like, what a great way to die, in the arms of someone that I love. And then she woke up. And that just shook me so much, because the thing is, that dream is so significant to this story. Olga witnessed so much death, undignified death, people being thrown in mass graves, people just dying on the side of the road, people dying in a blizzard, and you just walk past them and they're never gonna have that closure of being put in a grave and having their life be celebrated. And here she is having a dream of her life being celebrated, and she wants to die with dignity. That's all she wanted, was to die with dignity. And that was so moving to me. Another way that they preserved this legacy was through physical manifestations. Ludmilla cared for the tutsia, that little like walrus tusk that I talked about, and this like little mug that her daughter had. I forgot to mention that her daughter died after she was reunited. I can't believe I forgot to mention that, but her daughter had died of cancer. And so she lived out the last years of her life without her daughter. And she probably only spent like maybe like 10 collective years with her daughter in person. And her daughter died, and she kept these two objects as a manifestation of who her daughter was in her life. And Anna kept Nikolai's fine leather suitcase, as she called it, as a manifestation of who he was in her life. And she said you could still see, you know, all of the little like lice bugs and the bed bugs, like carcasses, like outlined in the suitcase, because she took it to camp with her and she took it back and she preserved it for so long. It was Nikolai to her. And I think that this just goes to show how deep these losses were for them. This family separation was so significant to them. And it's so important that we talk about it, because it took so much courage for them to write about this. I want this video and this writing to honor that. So let's talk about children. One of the things that really struck me about the children chapter was there's again this like juxtaposition between the ideology and the reality of how children were treated in the Soviet Union. A lot of these children were born in the 1930s, and so as they grew up, they experienced a lot of starvation, a lot of lack of resources, like I was talking about earlier, with the push for collectivization and industrialization came a lack of these resources. And so they still viewed their childhood as honestly like the best thing ever. Like they all talk about like viewing their childhood with a lot of love and nostalgia. And this kind of coincides with this famous like series of posters that were published in the late 1930s that are "Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for a happy childhood." They all basically say the same thing in Cyrillic. They basically published this to make Stalin look like the ultimate father figure. And that was kind of how he was projected in a lot of these children's lives for the majority of their life. With the children, there were two major traumas that they experienced. The first was a family separation that came with Order 00486 and being sent to orphanages or to live with family. And then the second was World War II. So a lot of them were separated from their family in like the late 1930s, so 1937, 1938, and then World War II started in about 1941. With the children, there were three main like psychological concepts that I wanted to tackle, because child psychology and adult psychology are just so very different. So the three concepts that I had were self-concept, PTSD in children, and parentified children. So self-concept is basically how you form your identity and how you form your values and you know, how you view yourself in the world around you. And then PTSD in children is just different because there are different behaviors that come with it. Sometimes it can be manifested, like the symptoms can manifest in different ways, but a lot of the time what's interesting about these children in particular is that they were taught silence, and so silence is like a survival method, and so they weren't able to fully manifest their PTSD in the same way that their parents were. And then there's this idea of parentified children, which is basically just giving children adult roles that they, as a child, cannot successfully fulfill. So the whole concept isn't so much about what role the child has, but the fact that they're never going to be successful and they're going to really struggle with that. And then their main source that I used was oral testimony. A lot of these children were able to talk about their memories after the fall of the Soviet Union, and so a lot of their memories were recorded in these like volumes of oral testimony. One of the most famous ones is Dzieci Gulaga by Simeon Valinsky. The subjects, I'm gonna go through a list. I don't have a lot of pictures, which is so heartbreaking to me because I just want to like see all their faces. But the subjects I have are Alexander Yudelovich Zakian, who is the son of Olga, who I just talked about, Ina Aronova Shikieva Geister, Irina Andreevna Dubrovina, Maya Rudolfovna Levitsina, Ludmila Borisovna Bibikova, Elena Borisova Bibikova, who are both sisters, Igor Arkadyevich Garyev, Yevgenia Delskaya, Svetlana Obolenskaya Osinsky, and that's all of them. I separated it into as a child of the enemy of the people, as survivors, as an evaluator, and as adults. So as a child of an enemy of the people, basically anybody that was targeted under Article 58 was like considered an enemy of the people. Any political prisoner basically was considered an enemy of the people. And so they were heavily discriminated against, and they kind of paid for their parents' crimes. I keep putting stuff in quotes because they aren't real. These are all fabricated things, right? So they paid for their parents' crime, even though I should note that Stalin said that a child should never pay for their father's crime. And a lot of parents commented on that in the Gulag. They're like, why is my child being treated in such a terrible way when I'm the one that's serving this crime? Why are they serving my crime too? Things that they experienced was homelessness. Not all of them experienced homelessness, but especially during the war, if they like lost track of their orphanage, or if their orphanage couldn't support everybody, some of the children were left to be homeless. I believe Geister, Ina Shikieva Geister, she was one that just never went into the orphanage system. She lived with her family, and then when her family evacuated Moscow, she was actually visiting her mother, and then she came back and nobody was there, and so she had to take care of her sisters by herself, and she was homeless basically. Like, she had a home, but in a way like there wasn't like an abstract idea of home. And then she lived kind of like by railroad tracks so that she could try to reunite with the rest of her family and stuff like that. So she had to struggle by herself a lot. Illness was common. Ludmila Bibikova was sick the night that her mother was taken away, and she developed like typhus, and then she ended up having infected tissue in her leg and had to keep getting surgeries, and then one leg kept growing, and that one leg, the other leg that was being operated on, never grew as fast, and so she had like a constant limp, and she was always in like this infirmary by herself, and that was something that was really difficult for her growing up. The orphanage was also sometimes like a hit or miss on whether it was a good place or a bad place. It was more often a bad place than a good place, just because the staff were usually pretty discriminatory towards children of political prisoners, telling them that they were unworthy, that they should forget their family, that they were scum, that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So a bunch of stuff that like children were consuming at a very young age that really affected their identity and their self-concept. Some of them even had name changes. Yevgenia Delskaya, she doesn't even know where that name came from. She doesn't know her family. And this was a specific tactic so that children wouldn't contact their families again, so that they could kind of have like a fresh start in a way. That was honestly just very cruel. There was a lack of touch. A lot of the children talked about you never get a hug. You never have someone like kiss your head. When you're sad, no one's ever gonna like embrace you and let you feel that love and that compassion, that nurturance. And then there was separation from siblings. This was another tactic that was used in the orphanage. Specifically, Lyudmila and Lenina Bibikova were able to stay together because of Lyudmila's condition, but the separation from siblings was very common, and it ended up in a lot of trauma for children who maybe even had their name changed on top of that, just like this separation from their family and that identity altogether. And the idea that someone could just restart and not care about their family was just such an absurd idea. And of course children were curious about where they came from because they had friends that had family, and they knew that they were different because they were orphans, and they knew that their past must have been shameful if they couldn't remember it, but they cared so much about their past. Fending for oneself and one's siblings, this is really common, especially with Ina Shikeva-Geister, who I mentioned was homeless with her siblings. Her sisters died because Ina ended up getting sick herself and then being sent to an infirmary and then coming back, and one of her sisters had passed away, and she put that on herself because she was the oldest sister and she felt like it was her responsibility to keep her sister alive, even though she was like 16. There was absolutely nothing that she could have done to keep her sister alive. And last but not least, discrimination, especially among their peers. It's really interesting how that kind of came up. So in the Soviet Union, there were two major children like clubs and organizations that children looked to be a part of as they grew up. The first one was the Komsomol. This was just like the party organization for children. And then there were the pioneers. You can kind of think of it as like scouts in a way. A lot of these children would apply for these programs and then they would be discriminated against because they were a child of an enemy of the people. And sometimes teachers would fight for them and say, no, you need to let them be a part of this club. And then sometimes the teachers would be like, I don't care, and they wouldn't let them be a part of the club. So it was kind of, again, hit or miss in that regard, but there was still discrimination even later in their life on whether they were able to get into a college that they wanted to get into or into the job field that they wanted to get into. There were some that were more prestigious. So if you were able to get into an exact science, that was a little bit easier for some of these people because there was less personal influence on an exact science. But if you wanted to get into humanities, where it takes a lot of like opinion and personal analysis and stuff like that, that was a little bit more of a dangerous field. And so a lot of children couldn't get those types of jobs. And then there were as survivors. I don't want it to be an entire like victim thing for these children because they did survive on their own. And you can think back to like my metaphor about the pine cones being seeded into the ground and having to grow their life for themselves and create these families and, you know, create their own lives for themselves by themselves. But along the way, they did have some saviors and nurturants. Usually this was any type of relative or sometimes nannies or orphanage personnel. Like some orphanage directors were truly angels to these children. And a lot of the time teachers too, like one of my favorite examples about a teacher is, I think it's also Ina Shikeva-Geister. She was talking about how her and her cousin were super concerned that her parents had been arrested and that his parents had been arrested. And so they went up to their teacher and they're like, our parents had been arrested. And they like really built themselves up on this whole thing. And their teacher was like, okay, go sit down. Like so like nonchalant about that, just to make the children feel a little bit more normal. And also children leaned into literature a lot, which interestingly enough, Uncle Tom's Cabin came up and I had to read it for the first time. I've been meaning to read it. It's just such a long book, but it's the theme of family separation really connected with these children. And then they would also read fantasy books just kind of as like a form of escapism. The last two sections is more like as an adult, like growing up with this trauma, what do their opinions, their mental opinions and their physical, you know, person, what does that turn into? And this is where this section as an evaluator comes into play. So they evaluated their parents, the Soviet system, and Stalin. And a lot of them, when their parents returned, they realized they hated their parents because their parents had left them in a way. They felt abandoned, even though their parents didn't want to abandon them. But then a lot of their parents came back with their own traumas. And so these children not only had to raise themselves, but they also had to take care of their parents as their their parents were aging and having these like episodes of psychosis and paranoia and all of this stuff, and a lot of them ended up resenting their parents. The Soviet system was also something that they resented over time. They realized this system was supposed to help me. This system was supposed to be something that brought me success, and instead it suppressed me. And Stalin also, the same idea that, you know, Stalin was supposed to be someone that I thanked for my happy childhood, and instead I'm like sitting here and I hate him because he targeted my parents. And a lot of them hearing Khrushchev's, it's called his secret speech, that's the speech I was talking about that was released in 1956, where he talked about how Stalin fabricated everything. Hearing Khrushchev say that was really, really healing for a lot of these children, because some of them had questioned their parents' innocence, and then they realized, okay, Stalin's just full of it and I hate him. And then lastly, as adults, so there's this concept called ghosts in the nursery, and it was coined by Selma Freiberg in 1974. And it's kind of like, I imagine it as like the seed for intergenerational trauma. So basically, it is like when unacknowledged or subconscious traumas are unintentionally passed on to children of trauma survivors. So some of them just don't want to be around their children at all. They think that they're gonna fail their children. They think that their children is gonna develop the paranoia that they themselves have. There's an interesting example, I think it's again Ina. Ina just has such great examples. She was talking about how she was pregnant and she told her husband, like, you're gonna have to do this on your own because I don't think I'm gonna be a good mom because I failed at, you know, raising my sisters and myself. Like, just this idea that their trauma influenced their identity of being able to care for themselves so much was something that really affected how they raised their children. And she even acknowledged, like, my son didn't have any trauma, but my daughter had my same paranoia. And that's just how intergenerational trauma works. So in conclusion, I really want to talk about the state of Gulag memory today. The purges in modern Russia and the Gulag in modern Russia are acknowledged and not at the same time. The Gulag is acknowledged, the purges not as much. I would say that Khrushchev did acknowledge the purges, but the Gulag didn't necessarily like close or anything. Forced labor didn't necessarily stop. Forced labor in modern Russia today is still a thing. The memory though, the reason why it's complicated is because of World War II. In Russia, they call it the Great Patriotic War. The thing is that Stalin led the Great Patriotic War, and he also led the purges. And the Great Patriotic War is kind of like their big victory in Russia. They say, you know, we won the war. But at the same time, people were being purged by Stalin. The Gulag was still operating under Stalin. Stalin caused a lot of death, as well as allowing this victory. And what Putin has done is he's kind of viewed it in very simplistic terms. Stalin is a victorious leader, he was a great leader, and there's nothing wrong with him. Because we don't acknowledge what happened with the purges, because the war was more important. And why is this more important? Because he's an imperialist. This just helps him with his like military day, May Day on May 9th, where they celebrate the victory from World War II again and again and again with a huge military parade. That's all a bunch of symbolism and propaganda, and this is no different. And so the Gulag tends to get short-sighted. That's not to say that there aren't Gulag museums. There is a Gulag museum in Moscow. There's a Gulag museum in Perm. It's, I believe it's called Perm 36, but they tend to lack an acknowledgement for who caused everything. A great example of this is in 1956, actually, as early as that, the KGB, which formerly was called the NKVD, the same organization that was in charge of a lot of these purges, was given permission to build dachas at the Butovo firing range. The Butovo firing range is just outside of Moscow, and it is known to have been the site of 20,000 plus of political prisoners during 1936 and 1937. These people were buried there. And then the KGB was able to build dachas just meters away from these mass graves. They were told not to dig more than 50 centimeters into the ground to build their dachas. And if you don't already know, dachas are summer homes. So it's kind of like completely enraging to know that as early as 1956, which is when rehabilitation started happening, they were allowed to build dachas that close to where something so terrible happened. Up until the 90s, it started to be contested of like, we need to memorialize this space. And because the Russian Orthodox Church was gaining so much power, they were given more authority over that space, and they were allowed to mainly memorialize people who were Russian Orthodox themselves. But that wasn't even close to the majority of people that were purged in that space. And so there was Gulag Remembrance organization called Memorial, and they tried to fight all of that, but they still weren't successful, and they still are trying to fight this idea. There's a lot of really great, they're based out of, I think, Italy at this point because they were pushed out of Russia, which again goes to show how contested Gulag memory is in Russia. But this is just all to say, what I'm doing here with this research is an attempt to honor a huge amount of people who lost their lives. So many people suffered and have not been given the closure that they need to be able to have their families move forward. So many of these people died before they had the closure that they needed. And they did incredibly courageous things like publishing memoirs, preserving letters that could have incriminated them, talking to people about memories that traumatized you. Having to relive trauma is an incredibly courageous act. And I think that this is something that I really wanted to do with this paper. I think that this is something that I made that I am so incredibly proud of researching. I am so incredibly proud of writing all of this and sharing it with you. And I hope that in you watching this, you share it with someone else, because this kind of history needs to be shared. I didn't write this to be successful in grad school. I wrote this because people needed help, and I was able to help them. One way that I can help them is by spreading their story. And so I hope that you can help me do that by sharing their story too. Instead of just comparing this, because this is something a lot of people do when I talk to them in America right now. They're like, we have gulags right now. Instead of just comparing this to modern politics, I want you to just sit with the memory that this stuff happened and reconcile with what humans do. Because that's the only way that we can move forward from moments like this, is to remember that humans can be cruel and vicious to each other. They can do unspeakable things. And the only way that we can move forward from these acts is to learn from them, be conscious of them, and be intentional to not let them happen again. But yeah, thank you again for watching this. I'll put links to the bibliography down below, as well as the other video I posted last year for herstory. And if you have any questions, please ask them below too, and I'll answer them in the comments. I'd love to answer questions. I will see you next time. I have no clue what I'm doing in the next video, so hopefully it's lighter than this. But yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye.